Hello, welcome to another reading from the Scargatherer series. It's Friday. I'm late again. I'm late for a really good reason this time, which is that I was about to sign in to start this, and then I suddenly remembered that I needed to order my dinner because we found a fish and chip shop that takes telephone orders online. The thing is that because they're trying to keep everybody socially distanced, they give you a pickup time. Last week I rang them at 10 to 6 and I got a pickup time for 20 past 8, by which time we were all very, very hungry. So today I've just rang them now, which means that it's fish and chips at 10 to 7, which is much more like it. So yeah, I feel like, I felt like it was worth being late for. We've had a good week. I hope you've had a good week. Sunshine's been amazing, hasn't it? It's been absolutely gorgeous, and it's still lovely out there. I was wondering about doing this in the garden, but I didn't have time to try it out. I did discover this afternoon that the Wi-Fi stretches as far as the lawn, which I wasn't sure it did, because it's at the front of the house and the lawn's obviously at the back. But it does seem to stretch, and so maybe if the weather continues to be lovely, I might do this. I might do this outside next week. Although, of course, there is the chaos of our children and any children that are next door and things like that. So maybe I'll decide against it. Anyway, oh, hang on a minute. I've also got a cup of tea I haven't quite managed to drink. So I've had a quick cup of tea before we start. I couldn't live without tea. Tea and wine. Anyway, chapter 10. Saving the Unicorn's Horn. Oh yes, they've just been out to the storytellers and they've come back, dead of night, wintry, freezing cold, gone to bed, very, very late, just gone straight to bed. And Joe's just been woken up the next morning by Lockie whispering to Aileen, so Lucy's parents whispering together, because they've just realised that somebody has been in and poisoned the dogs while they were out the night before. Right. Chapter 10. Poisoned? No, Lucy cried. Joe sat up and pulled on his tunic. Lucy had jumped out of bed. She must have been lying there, listening just like him. I'm afraid so. But who would do such a terrible thing? Was anything taken? Matthews asked. Aileen carried her reed lamp down to the end of the room. She lifted some planks from the floor beside the ones she had moved the day before. Beneath them was an even larger hole, and in it an enormous chest. She knelt down. It doesn't look like anyone's touched it. She took one of the keys from the end of the cord that hung on her belt and fitted it into the lock. It's all right. Everything's still in here. Including the horn? Lockie asked. Yes. Well, that's the most important thing. But who would be so cruel? Lucy cried again, moving towards where the dogs were lying. Her father caught her in his arms. Don't touch them, Lushak. They feel different now they're dead. You won't like it. He stroked her hair while she sobbed into his chest. I have an idea who it might have been. His face was grim in the half-light, but whether we'll be able to prove it is another question. Matthias had pulled on his clothes. I'll go and start digging a grave, he said. I'll help you. Lockie stood Lucy back on her feet and took 2 spades down from hooks. Luishak, Joe, wake the others and then go and fetch some water so we can start our day. He followed Matthias out into the yard. Joe roused Pedder and then put on the rest of his clothes. At the door, Aileen gave him and Lucy 2 wooden buckets each. She opened the door for them and glanced up and down the street, as though the intruder might still be somewhere nearby. But there was no one about. It was even colder this morning as they set off across town together. Joe shivered. A few flakes of snow gathered in doorways, and the ground was frozen hard. Lucy had stopped crying, but she didn't speak. Where do we get the water? Joe asked. The river, she said. Mother thinks it's cleaner. Anyway, there'll be a queue at the well on this side of town, unless it's frozen over. They walked on in silence again. Gradually, other people were emerging from their houses, many of them also carrying buckets. After a bit, Joe said, "The horn your father mentioned, is that supposed to be the unicorn's horn?" "Shh!" Lucy's eyes flared, and she looked around quickly to see if he'd been overheard. "How did you know we had one?" "You told me, remember, when I first arrived." "Not so loud," she whispered. "Why not?" Joe dropped his voice. "You know it isn't really from a unicorn. They don't exist." "Yes, it is. Matthias told me. It has magical powers. That's why my father wanted to be sure it hadn't been taken." "What kind of powers?" Joe tried unsuccessfully to keep the sarcasm out of his voice, but Lucy ignored his tone. "Healing powers, for one thing. You can grind it up to use in spells, and it can protect you too." Joe grinned. "So where did Matthias tell you it had come from?" Lucy glared at him. "It belonged to my grandfather. He brought it back with him from one of his voyages far away. When he was killed, he left it to my father's brother, who in turn left it to my father when he died." "Your grandfather was killed in the feud, wasn't he? How did your uncle die?" "In battle." "But if the unicorn's horn is supposed to heal and protect, surely it should have saved him." Joe watched with satisfaction while Lucy struggled to think of an answer. "He wouldn't have had it with him, of course," she said after a few moments, sticking out her chin. "And anyway, dying in battle is a good thing, like I was telling you yesterday." "Hang on," Joe frowned. "Is this the same brother that killed Thorbjorn's father?" Lucy nodded. "That's another reason why Thorbjorn hates our family. His father will have gone to Niflheim after my uncle killed him, but my uncle himself died a glorious death, so he's gone to Valhalla." "Is that really right? Don't you believe in some kind of punishment after death if someone murders someone else?" "It was Thorbjorn's family that started the feud," Lucy said. Joe shook his head. "All the same." "Anyway," Lucy said firmly, "the horn was given to my father. So why is it such a secret?" She glanced around again and then whispered, "Because it's incredibly valuable, of course. People pay a fortune for a few grains of its magical dust." "Why don't you sell it then? Just think, you could be rich, you could have a big house and servants, and eat meat every day." Lucy was shocked. "We can't do that." "There were words that came with it. Matthias told me. I don't know where from, perhaps from the unicorn itself." She recited solemnly, "Be sure of the horn to take good care. Your house shall else be cursed, beware." "But that's nonsense." Joe spluttered with laughter. "The rhyme only just makes sense. And even if there was such a thing as a unicorn, which there isn't, it couldn't talk, never mind put a curse on you. Matthias has been pulling your leg." Lucy hunched her shoulders. He could see she was offended, but he couldn't let it go. "Can't you see," he persisted, "if it did what you say, it would have kept your household safe. But what about your little brother who died?" She stopped in her tracks. "How do you know about Freddie?" she asked, alarmed. "I've never told you about him. We don't talk about him. It upsets my mother." "I just know," Joe said. "Like I was trying to tell you before, I knew you in a different time. Your little brother's name was Flavius then." Lucy took a step sideways, away from him, and then walked on again, keeping a wide gap between them. "You scare me sometimes," she muttered. "Anyway, you're wrong." She pulled her cloak tighter around her. "It does work. All of us were ill when we were small. Anya was really, really ill just after Freddie, but he was the only one who died." "How's that supposed to be good?" She glared at him again. "Every other family I know has lost at least 2 babies or children, sometimes 3 or even more." Joe said nothing. He tried to imagine what it might be like to have several brothers or sisters who died, but it was hard enough to imagine being one of 5 or 6 children in the first place. They reached the river and knelt down on the bank to fill the buckets. The force of the water nearly dragged Joe in. He grabbed a tussock of frosty grass and hung onto it while he hauled the first bucket out. It was really heavy. He filled the second bucket. As they started for home again, icy water slopped over his feet. "These weigh a ton," he said, stopping after a few steps to dry his hands on his cloak and get a better grip. "My arms are going to be like a gorilla's by the time we get back." Lucy looked at him scornfully, but didn't answer. Of course, he realised she wouldn't know what a gorilla was. Nonetheless, he couldn't help noticing that she had no trouble carrying her buckets, even though they were as large and as full as his own, and she herself wasn't any bigger than him. He felt vaguely annoyed. Neither of them spoke as they walked back. In the house, the fire was roaring again. Aileen took the buckets and poured water from the first of them into the porridge pot, which hung over the fire. Beside the hearth was a large space on the floor where the dogs had been. Joe couldn't help feeling a little bit relieved, though he knew better than to show it. Lucy's mouth was set in a stubborn line. She picked up a spindle and began to spin the wool Pedder had combed the previous afternoon. "What will you do about the dogs?" Joe asked Aileen, pulling up a stool beside Anya to carry on picking over the fleece. Lucy's mother stirred the porridge. "What do you mean, do?" "Will you report it? If someone's been into your house and killed your animals, shouldn't somebody do something about it?" She shrugged. "Lockie's gone to tell one of the town elders, and Matthias and Surka are asking up and down the street if anyone saw anything. Apart from that, there's not much we can do." "But I thought Lockie knew who'd done it," Joe said. Aileen shook her head. "He thinks it might have been Thorbjorn, but unless anyone actually saw him come into our house, we can't be certain." A niggling worry crept into Joe's mind. For a long time he looked into the fire. Then he said, "Do you think it might have something to do with me being here?" Aileen frowned. "How could it? You were with us last night for the storytelling. We know you didn't do it, even if the dogs were a bit funny about you." "It's only that Thorbjorn saw me as I was leaving the baths yesterday, so he knows I'm back. The way he looked at me—" Joe hesitated. "What?" It frightened me a bit," he mumbled. Aileen smiled kindly. "That's Thorbjorn for you, I'm afraid. He likes to bully and frighten younger children. I don't suppose it was aimed particularly at you, except that you were with my sons. You see, he doesn't like our family." "I know." There was a pause. Then Lucy said, "I wonder if you're right, though, somehow." He looked at her. Her irritation with him seemed to have gone. "You stopped him from stealing our chickens when you were here before. You might have scared him, too. Perhaps he hopes we'll blame you for the dogs, as though you're the bringer of bad luck or something." Joe nodded miserably. "I'm not, really." Aileen put a hand on his shoulder. "Of course you're not." They worked on together in silence, Anya and Joe picking over the wool, Pedder combing it, and Lucy spinning. Aileen had rolled up her sleeves and started kneading bread dough. After some time, Matthias and Surka returned. "Well, did anyone see anything?" They shook their heads. "Everyone was indoors," Surka said, "except for the people we saw at Inger's. They all came home the same time we did, which was too late." "I'm going to go round there," growled Matthias. "Somebody has to teach that boy a lesson." "You'll do no such thing," said Aileen curtly. "Your father will deal with this as he thinks best." "But if it is Thorbjorn, he'll do nothing. You know that. He feels so guilty that the boy has no father. He'll just let him get away with it. But Thorbjorn wants to provoke us, don't you see? He won't stop until he does." The muscles in Aileen's neck were taut. "It's clear he wants to breathe new life into the feud," she said, "but we can't let him." So we just turn a blind eye? Matthias's voice rose in outrage. First he steals our fish, then he accuses Pedder of theft, and now the dogs. What next? At that moment Lockie burst in. What on earth is going on in here? He demanded. I could hear you from the street. Matthias wants to take matters into his own hands. Aileen pummelled the dough with her fists. Lockie pulled out a stool and sat down. Don't do that, son, he said wearily. He rested his head in his hands. The thing is, we don't know for sure that it was Thorbjorn. The dogs might have eaten something poisonous during the day, and we didn't notice. And even if it was him, you punishing him won't put an end to it. He looked up. The elders say we should raise it at the next gathering, so let's forget about it for now. Aileen nodded. Why don't you make yourself useful, Matthias? She said. Serve out the porridge. They sat down in silence. Joe forced himself to eat his, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that this was all somehow connected to him. After breakfast, Lockie and Matthias opened up the workshop, and Aileen sent the rest of them out for some fresh air. It was too cold to sit still, so they wandered through the town, not speaking much, at a loss for what to do. In one of the open spaces Joe had noticed before, they came to a market. Lucy didn't seem very interested, and Anya, Pedder and Sorka had soon drifted away. But Joe wanted to have a closer look. Do you mind? He asked. You look bored. It's not that. Lucy raised her eyes from her feet. Normally I like this kind of market. I'm just not in the mood today. If you want to go back, I'll be fine on my own. She half smiled. Will you? You don't think you might get lost or land yourself in trouble again? I might, he conceded. It's all right, you can look round for as long as you like. There isn't actually anything I want to do, so I may as well stay with you. Together they ambled through the stalls. The traders were haggling with their customers, exchanging things for snippets of silver, or for one of the baskets of squawking chickens and geese that seemed to be everywhere. But they weren't selling the kinds of things that Joe would have expected, like fish or meat or eggs. These stalls were offering animal skins and jewellery. There were figures carved from what looked like ivory, and bowls made of stone. He gazed around, wide-eyed. The most popular stalls were selling polished amber and glass beads, silver and bronze dishes with intricate patterns, and brightly coloured fabrics. That's silk, isn't it? He pointed to some strips of material, woven with gleaming red and gold thread. And the spices, they must be from the Middle East. This is amazing. How on earth does it get here? Lucy shrugged. The men sometimes trade when they're away, so they can bring things back from further away than they can sail. We can't afford much of it, though. The silk especially is incredibly expensive, even for a tiny piece. It really is amazing, Joe said again, stopping in front of a stall selling shining swords and axes. You'd never find a market like this where I come from, and yet we think we have everything. At last, when he'd finally had enough, they walked on towards the river. On one of the bridges they stopped and looked down at the water. Lucy was still very quiet. Is there really nothing that can be done about Thorbjorn? Joe said. It does seem wrong that he can get away with something as cruel as killing your animals. She sighed. You heard what my parents said. They'd be furious if any of us tried to get revenge in any obvious way. The only thing we could do would be... She broke off. What? Well, she paused. There's a wise woman I've heard of. People get spells and curses from her. Really? Joe made a big effort to swallow his disbelief. The problem is, we'd have to pay. I don't know how much, but I don't have anything I can pay with anyway. They walked on for a while, both of them lost in thought. What does this woman actually do? Joe asked at length. I'm not sure. I think she carves the spell in runes on a bone or a piece of wood, and then you take it somewhere and put it where it has to do its work. Right, well, if you want to do that, what about using the chain of my St. Christopher for payment? Lucy's hand went up to her throat. We can't do that. I wouldn't want you to use the St. Christopher itself, Jo said quickly, but I get enough pocket money that I'm sure I can replace the chain when I get home. No, definitely not. She shook her head emphatically. It's too special. Jo felt a flush of pleasure that it meant something to her. In that case, he said, how about the unicorn's horn? If it's so valuable, we wouldn't need much. We could grind a bit off at the end. Your parents probably wouldn't even notice. As Lucy was thinking about this, Jo saw a movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head. In the alleyway they were just passing, a boy taller than him, with curly blonde hair, peeled himself away from the wall and disappeared between two buildings. Jo gulped. What's the matter? Lucy glanced across at him and then down the alleyway beyond. There wasn't anyone there, was there? No, Jo lied. It's nothing. He felt a shiver run over his skin. It might not have been Thorbjorn, he told himself. He hadn't seen the boy's face, and even if it had been him, maybe the older boy hadn't heard what he just said to Lucy. But why else would he have hurried away like that? Sickness churned in Jo's stomach. Had he really just let slip the secret of the family's most precious treasure to the worst possible person? Shall we go back? He said, trying to keep his voice casual. Already? Why? My mother usually expects us to stay out longer than this. You don't think she and your father have gone out as well and left the house empty, do you? I doubt it. There's almost always someone at home, even when nobody's in the workshop. Well, just in case, I think we should go back anyway. Lucy looked at him, bewildered. I don't understand you sometimes. 1 minute you're suggesting we should grind off some of the horn, which would mean waiting till everyone's out, and the next minute you're worrying in case there's no one there. Please. All right. She rolled her eyes. We'll go back this way then. They set off back towards Coppergate at a pace which seemed to Jo painfully slow. In his mind, he repeated the same words over and over. It wasn't him. He didn't hear. Everything will be all right. It wasn't him. He didn't hear. Everything will be all right. He only hoped it would be true. So that's the end of chapter 10. Saving the unicorn's horn. What has Jo done? Oh dear. But now it's the weekend, so there'll be no readings tomorrow or Sunday. I'll start again on Monday with chapter 11. And in this book there are 16 chapters. So I realised today when I was thinking about it that I'll do 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 next week, which means there'll be just one chapter, and it's a bank holiday weekend, and so that could mean that those of you who've caught up with everything would have quite a long wait. So probably I'll actually go straight on over the Saturday and do chapter 16 so we've got the book finished. And then we'll see how we go from there and see whether we might go on to book 3, which is Tudors. I love the Tudors. Anyway, I'm still quite enjoying the Vikings, although I am reminded of how much I would not want to live in Viking times. Don't you think? Food sounds really, really awful, I have to say. I love the idea of a meal ordeal instead of a meal deal. I reckon that's what it was like. Anyway, I will see you next Monday, or on Monday coming, so I hope you have a nice weekend.